Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and thank you for your patience. When they said technical issues, they were all mine. My computer crashed, and then one after another, different programs crashed. And my heart is in my mouth to see if they crash again mid talk. So please keep all your fingers crossed for me that it doesn't all go kaput. So let me try and share my screen so I can show you pictures. And hopefully you can see my PowerPoint.
All good, Debbie. All good.
That's all good. Great. Thank goodness. Right, so there's a little bit of a Coles to Newcastle quality in the talk here, talking about Britishness in Northern Ireland, because in some senses I think you might know more about it than me. But let's see how we go. So I'm a historian of the First World War and of its cultural history, and I'm very interested in how we can look at commemoration to learn more about Britishness and the changing nature of Britishness and the complexity of it. There's a historian, a late historian, a German man called George Mossey, who wrote that war memorials and military cemeteries became shrines of national worship in the wake of the First World War. So that directs us to memorials as a place that tells us something interesting about national identity. But of course, if we're thinking about it in the British context, we have to think about what the nature is of that nation. So there are at least four nations that make up a supranational identity of Britishness at the time of the First World War. But it's even more complex than that, of course, because inherent in Britishness are a complex set of relationships between local, regional, national, and imperial layers of identity. And the wake of the First World War is a period when Britishness was very much in flux. I would say that the two most important consequences of the war was the achievement of votes for women and the breakup of the United Kingdom. Of course, it's the creation of Northern Ireland in 1921 and then the independence of the Irish Free State in 1922. And those two events made commemoration of Irish participation in the British Army tremendously fraught. And let me move my slide forward. And that relationship only started to be fully resolved in the 21st century, particularly embodied in the state visit of Queen Elizabeth II to Ireland in May 2011. And the Irish Times wrote at the time that this was the week that Anglophobia died. But since then, the Brexit vote and the ensuing Northern Ireland protocols been a reminder of how fraught the issue is of the relationship of the different islands and trade between them. Another way of looking at Britishness in the wake of the First World War is to think about the wider empire. And we see the start of the steady detachment of Australia from Britishness. And when I'm not looking at war memorials in the British Isles, I'm a historian of Gallipoli and of Anzac Day. And through Anzac Day, you can, and the commemoration of Gallipoli, you can trace the changing nature of Australia's attachment to Britain. And I'll come back to Australia and Britishness towards the end of the paper. Curiously, given those massive changes to the United Kingdom in the early 20s, it did not prompt a separatist Scottish nationalism. Yes, the SNP was founded in 1934, but there was very limited support for the SNP until the 1960s. So, and during the centenary, I think there was some limited attempts by the SNP to kind of mobilise the Scottish role in the war for their cause, and there was some misleading stats on Scottish war dead that I noticed being used at one stage. But well, I'll talk more about the relationship of Scottishness to Britishness as can be perceived through war memorials in a moment. So what I'd like to do is to work my way through a series of national memorials to explore the nature of Britishness just after the First World War. And I'll start with England and London. Because London is a site of a number of national memorials to key individuals like Lord Kitchener. And then in 1920, 3 collective national memorials came into being. On the same day, on 11th of November, you have the unveiling ceremony of the Cenotaph, and then they move on to the interment of the tomb of the unknown warrior in his tomb in Westminster Abbey, and you have the inauguration of the Imperial War Museum. All these 3 things happened in 1920, and all of those 3 are memorials for the empire, and any distinct sense of Englishness was completely subsumed within an imperial Britishness. The English had long since learned to bury their national identity within Britishness. And a symptom of this is the way that the language of the day flips between England and empire entirely unconsciously. So these memorials were paid for by the British government, they were unveiled by the King, and they were located in the symbolic heart of empire. The Imperial War Museum was started life as a plan in 1917 for a national war museum. The idea became imperial in 1918, and it was opened by the King in June 1920. The Cenotaph, as I'm sure you're aware, is an ancient Greek form, and it was deliberately chosen as a non-Christian form to commemorate all the empire's dead. In response to that came the idea for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers, so that a warrior rather, so that there was some Christian commemoration. And the inscription is, "He died for king and country, for loved ones, home and empire." So you have that conflation of country and empire, nation and empire there in the wording. Now, no English national memorial was ever proposed. So this is the most perfect blurring of Englishness and Britishness. You can also see it in the, another example is the Imperial War Graves Commission, which are designed purposely to replicate English graveyards around the world. Englishness and imperial British identity are entirely conflated. So no national English memorial in London. Let's turn to Scotland. Oh, and I forgot to show you my picture of the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior. To the Scottish National War Memorial. So the Scots used their imperial sentiment to assert a separate but equal Scottish identity within Britishness. The driving force behind the Scottish National War Memorial was the Duke of Atholl. And when that 1917 proposal for a national museum, a national memorial that turned into being the Imperial War Museum, came forward in 1917, he made a public statement saying that if the people of Scotland wished to have a national war memorial to commemorate their own dead, it would not be in Hyde Park, London, which was the proposed original site for a national museum. So it would not be in London and put up with Scottish, with government money. Instead, he said it would be put up by Scottish hands with Scottish money on Scottish soil. So he went about setting up a committee of Scotland's great and good, and they were frequently conservative in their politics and hence unionist. They were often aristocratic, they were often Presbyterian and ex-armed forces, and for the most part, they were deeply involved in service to the community, the country, and the empire. They raised an absolutely vast sum of money for the Scottish National War Memorial, £111,500, and 45% of that total came from the largest single donation, which was from a West Coast industrialist. So we see an interesting combo of the balance of power, sort of old money and aristocracy organising it, and new money and industrialists funding it. But also there was more than 1 million individuals donated to the Scottish National War Memorial, contributing that's 1 million out of a population of about 5 million. So that demonstrates real breadth of support for this project. They also received significant funds from the Scottish diaspora in 20 different countries. And so Scots across the empire and beyond imagined themselves to be part of that imagined community of Scottishness. They built the memorial within the commanding location of Edinburgh Castle. And to do that, in doing so, they located the First World War, this shocking modern industrialised warfare, within a tradition of a series of key episodes in Scotland's history. The castle has associations with Robert the Bruce, with Mary Queen of Scots, with the Jacobites. So it says that the First World War must be and can be understood within Scotland's history. The design itself evokes Scottish identity by reference to religion, history, and empire. The architect was Sir Robert Lorimer, and he designed. You can see here the location of the shrine that was designed right prominently within Edinburgh Castle, which dominates Edinburgh's skyline. And Lorimer designed a hall of honour with an octagonal shrine abutted, so the octagonal part is on the left of the picture here. They didn't include a chapel because they were worried about sectarianism. They nonetheless aimed for a sacred character within the building. There's a distinct Presbyterian sensibility to it. There's extensive religious symbolism. There's a stained glass window in the shrine. There's Alice Meredith Williams' sculpture of the Archangel Michael suspended above the casket containing the Roll of Honour. And the idea here was to symbolise righteousness overcoming wrong in the spirit of good and the spirit of evil. And they wanted to affirm the nobility of sacrifice by the Scottish nation that occurred during the war. They also tried very hard to be inclusive of all the nation, everyone in the nation's efforts. So there are stained glass windows in the memorial which acknowledge the efforts of the home front. There's this bronze frieze, which you can see a picture, a section of it here on the screen, within that octagonal shrine. And this frieze shows 74 contemporary figures, and there's every rank and unit employed demonstrated here. There's also memorials to a full range of regiments, formations and services in the memorials throughout the building, including very, very unusually women's services. But most prominent amongst them were the 12 Scottish regiments. Each one has its own arch, and many of these memorials describe the origins of the regiments and lists their pre-1914 battle honours too. So again, it incorporates the First World War battles into centuries of Scotland's martial traditions. The names of all Scots who died are listed in the Roll of Honour in the casket, which sits on a stone of remembrance, and you can see carved there a cross of sacrifice and Kipling's words, their name liveth. And the names in the Roll of Honour included all Scots who died, Scots in other units from Empire, and non-Scots who served in nominally Scottish ones, for example, South African Scots. The memorial was opened at 11 AM on the 14th of July 1927 by the Prince of Wales, and all denominations were represented, with the exception, Christian denominations were represented with the exception of the Roman Catholic Church. And instead, the Roman Catholic Church held a simultaneous mass in St Mary's Cathedral elsewhere in Edinburgh. And absolutely enormous crowds were attracted to the opening and in the days that followed. So this is a memorial that really found favour with the Scottish people. Let me turn now to what they did in Wales. Oh, sorry, there's a wonderful sculpture of a lion outside the opening, the entrance to the Scottish memorial. And this is the scene after the opening ceremony. Okay, now to Wales. So the memorial in Cardiff lacks the imperial trappings of the Scottish memorial, and its organisation was marked by quite a lot of apathy. There were false starts until in 1919, a Cardiff-based newspaper, the Western Mail, proposed a memorial and started fundraising. So the origins of the Welsh National War Memorial lie in a commercial entity. The newspaper was conservative in its inclination, as was the memorial that was the committee that was formed to organise the memorial. And they found fundraising an uphill struggle. They did pretty well on the first day, 26th of October 1919. They got in over £1,000, but they soon ran out of steam. And there was a distinct lack of enthusiasm outside of Cardiff for the project. By January 1920, they'd raised £24,000. The architect they chose was J. Ninian Comper, who is Scots-born and Surrey-based, so not Welsh in any regard. And they had a bit of trouble finding a location for the memorial. Originally, they wanted to site it in front of City Hall in Cardiff, but that was rejected because of the impact that it was thought that the memorial would have on the facade of the National Museum of Wales. So in the end, they decided on another city centre location in Alexandra Gardens. And it's on that site, it's surrounded by City Hall, the University, the Glamorgan Building, and what's now the Welsh Office. The design that they chose is a sunken court and fountain surrounded by a seat and a circular colonnade. It's 60 feet in diameter. There are 4 figures, a soldier, sailor, and airman, each holding a wreath aloft, plus the messenger of victory. And there's a Latin inscription, which translates as, "In this sign thou shalt conquer." There's an inscription by Sir Henry Newbold, which is repeated in Welsh, and it says, "To the sons of Wales who gave their lives for their country in the war of 1914 to 1918. This memorial was unveiled in June 1928 by the Prince of Wales again, and there were Welsh dignitaries, including Lloyd George, in attendance, and the crowds were described as being 10 deep. The Western Mail described the memorial ceremony as the act of the whole race, but really that's hard to sustain. Yes, it was a bilingual ceremony and distinctively Welsh in character. There was an appropriate range of church leaders, regimental representatives, local officials, the Prince of Wales and the Welsh ex-Prime Minister. They sang 2 hymns, plus Land of My Fathers and God Save the King. But the memorial itself is Greek in form. The organising committee aimed for the idea of a shrine rather than ensuring its essential Welshness. It wasn't designed by a Welshman. It was not made from Welsh materials. It's made from Portland stone. And most of the money did not come from across Wales. It was mainly from Cardiff and Glamorgan. So if we apply the Scottish National War Memorial's yardstick of by Scottish hands with Scottish money on Scottish soil and its rich array of symbols, if we transpose that to the Welsh situation, the Welsh National War Memorial seems to be only quite Welsh and not very national. And part of the reason I say that is because there's an absence of national unity. Cardiff was seen as too cosmopolitan and anglicised to be truly Welsh. And so there's actually another semi-national memorial in North Wales that's erected. So this is a photo of the North Wales Heroes Memorial in Bangor. They raised £90,000 by 1924, which is to say 3.5 times as much as the supposedly national memorial in prosperous Cardiff. The money was raised in North Wales, in London, Liverpool, Manchester, Stockport, Shanghai, and the Welsh Hospital in India. And they not only built this memorial, but they built a science block for the University of Bangor, and they endowed 50 university scholarships. It's quite a modest memorial. They spent £15,000 on it. They chose a Tudor-style two-storey gateway in Portland stone, and they list 8,000 fallen men organised into counties and localities. There are memorial bearings carved in the stonework, which relate to the towns and counties of North Wales. And here's a doorknob with a Welsh dragon on it. There's the inscription in Welsh and in English reads, "In memory of the heroic sons of Gwynedd and Powys, 1914 to 1918. And this memorial was opened by the Prince of Wales in 1923. So it seems to me that this memorial is much more rooted in Welsh culture and community than its southern counterpart. Now, if the national memorials in Wales reveal an essential cultural disunity and an intense localism, the situation in Ireland was, of course, far more acute and politicised. So we turn to the Irish National War Memorial in Dublin. The appeal for it was launched in July 1919 by a committee that was staffed largely by staunch unionists, but there were nationalists too. Captain Stephen Gwynn, the former MP for Galway, was on the committee. And the fundraising started quite well. They'd raised £36,000 by the end of 1919. Then it starts to stutter, and they'd only got to £41,500 by October 1920. And the backdrop, of course, is the intensifying violence between the IRA and the British forces from late summer 1920 onwards. And progress draws to a halt. And in the end, the original scheme is postponed in 1923, the end of the Civil War. One of the things they'd wanted to do was to create a hostel for British soldiers passing through Dublin, and that was deemed impracticable. Nonetheless, the work on the Roll of Honour continued, and 8 volumes decorated with ornate borders drawn by Harry Clarke were created. And he used Celtic and Art Deco motifs, battle scenes, medals, insignia, and religious and mythological scenes. In 1924, a new scheme for a memorial in Merrion Square in Dublin was proposed and provoked tremendous opposition. One resident of the square wrote to newspapers, "The West Britons must learn they do not own Ireland." There's a vehement body of opinion in Ireland which viewed commemoration of the Great War as inherently pro-British. And another example of this is the phenomenon of snatching poppies from people's lapels each November. Then we have the matter of the symbolic geography of it. So Merrion Square is in front of the Irish seat of government. And Kevin O'Higgins, on behalf of the Executive Council, explained, "I do not want to see the little park in front of this state's seat of government dedicated to the memory of those who fell in the Great War. It is not on their sacrifice that this state is based, and I have no desire to see it suggested, but it is." So the memorial could not be in Merrion Square. In 1929, they finally found an acceptable location, Island Bridge, which is 3 miles from the centre of Dublin. The designer that they selected was Sir Edwin Lutyens, the Empire's foremost designer of war memorials. The design involved remodelling parkland and creating a monumental building to include a stone of remembrance, 2 fountains, a high cross set upon a flight of steps, pavilions for name records, and a garden of remembrance. That plan was too expensive for the funds collected, but the government agreed to fund the park redevelopment. The Irish government did not fund the memorial though. But it remains the case that the most politically difficult memorial was the only one outside London to benefit from any state funding in any shape or regard. Work on it began in December 1930 and was completed in April 1937. And then they tried to organise an opening ceremony, and again it was fraught with difficulty. The British Legion wanted the usual trappings of a commemorative ceremony, though they wanted a date other than the 11th of November so that ex-servicemen from Great Britain, Northern Ireland and Cross Island could attend. They chose the Earl of Cavan, who was thought to be politically neutral, to open it. And they wanted him preferably to be styled as the king's representative in doing so. They wanted representatives of the dominions and allied armies and detachments from the defence forces of Eire, the Irish Guards and Band, and the Inniskillen Fusiliers. And the British Legion very much hoped there'd be no objections if they wore their uniforms. The private view within the Irish government was that there was far too much emphasis laid on the imperial and military aspect of the function. And what they did was they used the deteriorating international situation as an excuse to postpone the ceremony. So the memorial was never officially opened, but it was used from 1940 onwards on Armistice Day without parades or undue displays. And post the Second World War, the memorial fell into disrepair. Restoration work began on it in 1985, and it was opened finally in 1988. And in 1995, the first government-led ceremony to commemorate the Irish dead of the Second World War took place. So here we see some of the familiar iconography of other Imperial War Graves Commission sites. So to Northern Ireland. The British Legion's ideas for the Irish National War Memorial ceremony were unacceptable in the British context of pre-partition. Irish service in the war would be strongly apparent, and it was anathema to the Fianna Fáil government of Ireland. Unionists from Ulster would have been troubled by attending and thereby emphasising their own Irishness. Commemoration there was about, so instead, commemoration in Northern Ireland was about asserting the Britishness of the new statement of Northern Ireland and affirming Ulster's Protestant heritage. There was no national memorial in Northern Ireland, and the closest equivalent would be the Ulster Memorial Tower at Thiepval. It has its origins as I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, of course, as a regimental memorial to the 36th Ulster Division. And even when ostensibly it becomes a national memorial for all of Ulster, and including nationalists of the 16th Division, doesn't really shake off the symbolism of Protestant Ulster commitment to the British Union. The Ulster Tower appears to visitors to the area to be on par with national memorials to Australia, South Africa and Newfoundland nearby. Those dominions were trying to establish a separate identity apart from Britishness, but the Northern Ireland itself is intent on binding itself tightly to Britishness. So there's a complexity and intense sensitivity about the relationship between Irishness and Britishness. Let me return to where I started momentarily to look at the unknown warrior again. So when the unknown warrior was interred in Westminster Abbey, the Times reported that he may have been born to a high position or to low. He may have been a sailor, a soldier, an airman, an Englishman, a Scotsman, a Welshman, an Irishman, a man of the Dominions, a Sikh, a Gurkha. No one knows. And that, of course, is the power of the symbolism of it. And therefore, that single unknown warrior stood for all of the dead of the empire. And when it was briefly mooted that maybe Australia would have something similar, the Premier of Victoria, Harry Lawson, said in 1921, "We should be satisfied with the burial in Westminster Abbey, and it would only cheapen that memorable event if a similar action were taken in Victoria. Separate burials in each state would be even less desirable than one for the Commonwealth. The warrior buried in Westminster Abbey was our hero as much as he was the hero of any other part of the empire. His tomb is a symbol of British unity, and for aught we know to the contrary, he might be an Australian." So there's a central unity within the empire in this regard. And yet, over the years, Australia has carved its own identity and pulled away from that original sense of Britishness. It's a much more multicultural country from the 60s onwards, and particularly from the 90s. And in 1993, they decided it was time that they needed their own unknown soldier. And so with tremendous ceremony, he was laid to rest in the Hall of Memory inside the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. And where Australia leads, other former dominions follow suit. So Canada decided it needed its own Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Ottawa in 2000. So a body was exhumed from a cemetery near Vimy Ridge and interred in front of the Canadian National War Memorial there. And you can see that they've combined some Canadian iconography and French and English language inscriptions. And you can see in the bottom left the parade with Mounties and the flag and the maximum ceremonial pomp and circumstance. And finally, we have New Zealand. New Zealand interred its own unknown warrior in 2004 in Wellington, in front of its own national memorial. Now, the Australian War Memorial is quite interesting. It combines the Imperial War Museum and the Cenotaph, and now the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, all in one. And it's been quite controversial lately. Its mission has since 1941 has been focused on wars overseas, and there's been no acknowledgement of any violence within Australia. Within the sort of central arcade of the War Memorial, there is this a pool of remembrance, and there are various flora and fauna as gargoyles. Flora and fauna of Australia, and amongst them is this gargoyle, this Aboriginal Australian, and for a long time that was the only way in which Aboriginal Australians were represented in the memorial, and that was until October this year. With a change of government, a decision has been made that what's known as the Frontier Wars will be recognised and represented within the Australian War Memorial as well. The Frontier Wars being the violence against Aboriginal Australians in the course of British settlement of Australia and Tasmania. So finally, in this sort of temple to Australianness, Aboriginal Australians are being brought into the fold. And the last slide I want to show you, yes, there we go, is a picture that I took in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission headquarters in the summer. They've got a very large display. This is kind of 6 foot tall, explaining that they are looking into the ways in which non-white participants in the British war effort often weren't properly buried and commemorated, and they're trying to figure out who's buried where and who's being overlooked. These are people like the Egyptian Labour Corps and West African carriers. So to try and pull some threads together from this talk. So back in the 90s, Linda Colley wrote a very interesting book about Britishness, and she argued that Britishness was forged in a series of wars against France between 1707 and 1837, that Britishness was superimposed on an array of internal differences. And warfare against Germany between 1914 and 1918 both reaffirmed and undermined that Britishness. Some differences were brought to breaking point. Only in Ireland were the differences over Britishness per se. Within Great Britain, the unifying bond of imperial Britishness was uncontroversial, but of differing levels of relevance. So In Wales, the symbolism of the empire scarcely figures. Unlike the Irish memorial, it doesn't have Kipling's then name liveth or the Stone of Remembrance, but loyalty to empire and to Wales were entirely compatible. The difficulty was the nature of Welshness itself, due to intense localism and cultural and political differences. In Scotland, there were internal divisions too. There was plans for a Highland or a Roman Catholic memorial, but they came to nothing. The relationship to the empire was celebrated rather than suppressed or ignored. The Scottish National War Memorial shows the unity of the Scottish nation and an ongoing strength of a martial tradition. And they could express a distinctive identity whilst remaining securely within the UK. In terms of England, well, its position within the empire and imperial Britishness was so dominant and secure that a separate identity was entirely unnecessary, which brings us back to that slippery and inconsistent use of key terminology as a result. Further afield, the bond of imperial Britishness was uncontested in terms of deferring to a single tomb of the unknown warrior in London. But through the 20th century, that allegiance weakened. And Australia led the way in nationalising its unknown soldier, followed by Canada and New Zealand. And now, in the wake of Black Lives Matters and the increasing acknowledgement of Indigenous rights and the costs of imperialism, we're finally seeing a reckoning with the omissions and exclusions of a century ago. It's a vivid reminder of the ways in which the present shapes our perceptions and representations of the past. The past is never dead, it's not even past. Thank you.